13 minutes before 7 o'clock, welcome back to Morning Live, and thank you so much for staying with us. Now, although South Africa's Bill of Rights is considered among the best in the world, experts agree that a violation of rights is common in the country. Stories such as that of a 5-year-old Michael Komape, who drowned in a pit toilet at a primary school outside Polokwane in 2014, are an example of the inadequacies in the system. But to discuss how far we've come in terms of the recognition of our human rights as we are marking Human Rights Month, we're joined now in our studios by Gail Smith. She's the spokesperson of the South African Human Rights Commission. Gail, good morning to you. Thank you so much for coming through.
Good morning, Palisa, and happy International Women's Day to you.
Happy International Women's Day to you too. Now, we're marking Human Rights Month, really the question is, how far have we come? I mean, we come across a whole lot of stories for human rights violations. How far have we come in South Africa in terms of the observations of human rights?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because it assumes that we have a baseline. So it assumes that at a certain point we counted and now we can measure. So that's a very difficult question to answer. How far have we come? I think in general terms we've come a long way in that, one, we have an amazing constitution which is globally revered. So we have come a long way with respect to human rights, in that a lot of people are beginning to understand their rights. And that's really important to understand, that if you don't know your rights, you can't assert your rights. And we're seeing that with increasing complaints, people are increasingly understanding their human rights. And I think South Africans and people, remember, our constitution protects everyone in the country, not just South African citizens. So we are certainly seeing a lot more rights assertion, which indicates to us that a lot more people actually do know their human rights and are beginning to understand them.
Yeah, which is really not the case when you go to your deepest rural areas. You still find these cases of violations of human rights taking place, and only to be exposed at a later stage. So it actually brings me to my next question of how can people empower themselves in terms of their knowing about their human rights?
Well, that's a very important question, and we do a lot of rural outreach, especially to address that in the rural, sort of the far outlying areas. We do a lot of legal clinics. Our advocacy officers go out and explain human rights to people. You have to understand that our constitution, because it is so sophisticated, most people only understand race, racial discrimination. They don't understand. So, for instance, you mentioned Michael Komape. He fell down a pit latrine toilet. That speaks to the absence of the Section 27 rights, which is access to water, sanitation, and social security.
True.
So people are experiencing their rights, but experiencing, the disempowerment, but they're not understanding that they actually have a constitutionally guaranteed right to social security, to water, to sanitation. And the Human Rights Commission does a lot of work in those rural and far-flung areas, specifically to educate people about their rights so that they can then lodge complaints.
Yeah, and we made mention of the fact that it's International Women's Day today. We're reading reports of a group of women who were allegedly forced to strip and searched after menstrual blood was found at their workplace. So these are the kind of cases that you come across, because I believe that you are also looking into that case as well. Okay,
yes, we're aware of that case. Now, you must remember that the Constitution makes provision for a whole range of institutions to support democracy. So we have the Human Rights Commission, you have the Gender Commission, you have the Commission for Language and Culture. So that specific case would fit more within the mandate of the Gender Commission.
Yeah.
However, because rights are interrelated, there is a sort of crossover of the mandate. And I think with respect to our mandate, what that speaks to is that labour has consistently been one of the top 5 human rights violations in South Africa since 2012. That's a labour violation, but that's also a violation of what the Constitution calls rights to bodily integrity.
True.
And that's that was a very significant step in South Africa, especially for women. Women have the right to control their own bodies. Women have the right to decide what goes into their bodies and what comes out of their bodies. And that was both a labour violation and a violation of those women's bodily integrity. And we do see, you do see lots of those labour-related human rights violations taking place in workplaces around the country. And it's something that is of grave concern to the Human Rights Commission. And in fact, one of our main events for this month is we're looking at business and human rights. So we're having a roundtable on business and human rights because we believe that businesses have a responsibility to ensure the protection of the human rights of the people who work within the organizations.
It certainly does. Now, going back to the story of Michael Komape, such stories, what do they expose about the capacity of our government?
They expose that there is widespread lack of access to the basic services, and I think you see this through the widespread protests that are arising. And that's one thing I think South Africans are very aware of, the fact that they do have rights to, a relative degree of water and sanitation. So that's what it speaks to. It speaks to widespread dissatisfaction with the levels of service delivery around the country.
Yeah, and we talk about rights, but in some instances you would actually realize that as much as people have rights, but they're not aware of their responsibilities, or they are aware but they tend to ignore their responsibilities. So rights and responsibilities go together.
Absolutely, and that's the difficult thing in a country like South Africa, anywhere really. We have our constitution is really broad, but all of those rights and protections do come with responsibilities, and it's always a way, you always have to weigh up the rights versus the responsibilities. So for instance, you do have a right to access to education. However, you then have the responsibility to not impede somebody else's access to the same thing. So for instance, we see widespread protest action that is targeting schools, that targets schools, and that's a particular case where people have a right to protest, but they don't have the right to deny access to education, especially to children, because education is a facilitative right. Yeah. If you interrupt a child's education in a foundational phase, it has a devastating impact down the line in that child's life, and so we recreate cycles of inequality and poverty. And a lot of our work is trying to explain to people that you do have the right to protest, but when you protest in such a way that you stop children from going to school, you have a devastating impact not just on that child but on that community.
Infringing on their rights as well. And you get some people who are of the view that the Commission of Human Rights always comes in and steps in when there are big cases that are taking place, so it is sort of a toothless body. Talk to us about the success rate of the cases that you deal with and how far you can go in terms of investigating your mandate really in general.
Yeah, the accusation that we're a toothless bulldog is an interesting one, and it's one that we take with good grace, because you have to understand that in the previous regime used vicious bulldogs to impose vicious dogs to impose apartheid. So you cannot build a culture of respect, you cannot build a culture of human rights being a vicious dog. We do bare our teeth when we have to. We bared our teeth with the oncology crisis in KZN, where we held the provincial MEC to account, and we are in the process of doing that. The difficulty with human rights work is that it's difficult to tout your successes because so many of the violations are so egregious. So often when we do have a successful story, we can't necessarily run to the media and say, hey, we've resolved the situation, because we don't want to expose the people who've already been victimized to secondary victimization. So, a couple of our most recent successes, we had a transgendered pupil in Limpopo who made full disclosure that she was transgender. She was allowed to wear a girl's uniform, and she was allowed access to the school. The principal had no problem with it. But over time, she was being then subjected to awful harassment, really, really egregious invasions of her privacy. She came to us and we took it to the Equality Court. Another success we had was in the John Kwelane matter, the hate speech matter against John Kwelane. So a lot of another case we had was a case of a little boy who was 3 years old who had a severe respiratory condition that was threatening his life. He was going to die. But because his mother was an undocumented migrant, he couldn't get access to it. We did intervene with Charlotte Maxeke Hospital and got him the life-saving care that
So
he
there are a
needed.
number of successful cases that you've dealt with. In terms of listeriosis, we know that the outbreak about listeriosis is something on the news lately. Are you also intervening in that regard?
Well, because of our mandate, where another statutory body is already involved,
you don't come in.
Well, it would be pointless. The minister is already involved. The Minister of Health is hugely involved in this matter, and so it would be unnecessary for us to then step in as well. It is being dealt with by another high-level institution.
All right, Gail, we have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for coming through.
Teresa.
Thank you so much indeed to Gail Smith. She's the spokesperson to the Human Rights Commission, talking to us about this month as we are marking Human Rights Month. We're taking a quick ad break here on Morning Live. Your news at 7 will follow. Don't go away.